Originally, I wanted to do a really elaborate video talking about my DIY cold plunge setup, but one thing led to another, and now we're moving, so I kind of have to put a quick video together to just go over all the parts and what I put into this setup, how much it cost me, and some of the thought process of why I wanted to set up a DIY cold plunge rather than going out and buying one. So this is going to be a little bit more run and gun, not a big fancy video because my garage is a mess, and this cold plunge is now taken apart and drained because I'm getting ready to pack it up and get out of this place. So real quick, let's just talk about the setup and the essentials of what you need if you want a DIY cold plunge setup. Really, cold plunge setups are very simple. At its core, you need a container, tub, or a trough, or a barrel, something to put the water in. And then you need a pump to pump the water out and in to the container, and a chiller that the water runs through in order to cool it. And for my setup, I decided to use a 150-gallon Rubbermaid trough that you can find at a Tractor Supply or any of those farm stores and maybe even a hardware store. I chose to go with the 150 over the 100-gallon because it was just a little bit bigger. It felt like I had more room in there. I'm 6'1" and 200 pounds. And when I went to the Tractor Supply and I tried the different troughs that they had, I liked the 150 a little bit more. I went with the Rubbermaid because these don't leak as much as some of the metal troughs do. I watched a lot of videos on the metal troughs, and there was a lot of people saying that you had to kind of seal them, and they dealt with a lot of leaks. I will say one thing: if you decide to go with one of these, this drainage valve here is not sealed. So what I had to do was I ended up going in and putting Teflon tape all around it really tight to get a good seal, because unfortunately when I first set this up, this had a small leak which caused a lot of water to pull up underneath it, and it was kind of a pain. And this Rubbermaid stock tank cost me about $189 from Tractor Supply. On to the next piece of equipment that you need for your cold plunge setup to work is a pump. This is the pump I decided to go with. It's a submersible pump. It's made by EcoPlus, the same company that makes the chiller that I chose to go with. It was the one that Amazon suggested to buy because of the amount of water that it can process and pump with the chiller that I ended up purchasing. This is the EcoPlus 1267. This EcoPlus submersible pump costs $89 on Amazon with my chiller. You can just stick it right in the tank like so, and this would pump water into your chiller, and then you have a line that comes back from the chiller with the cold water. And I'll quickly show how all that works in a sec, but I want to talk about the chiller that I decided to go with. So this is the EcoPlus 1.5 horsepower water chiller. This thing is a beast. It is big, it is heavy, it's about 100 pounds, but it works very well. It will get your water cold way faster than the smaller chillers will, but it was pretty expensive. I got it when it went on sale on Amazon for $12.50, but it's usually about $1,600. I know that seems pretty expensive, and it is. If you've actually researched cold plunges and you're looking into buying one that's all set up for you, you'll know that some of them are as much as like $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, depending on how fancy you want to get. And a big reason why I decided to make my own setup was because it was a lot cheaper. If you do your research and you look at those setups that you can buy online, a lot of the times it's a 3rd horsepower chiller, or sometimes it'll be a 1/2 horsepower chiller. But this is a 1.5 horsepower chiller. It's so powerful, and it cools the water down so fast. Like in a few hours, I could take this water from 70 degrees down to 40. You're not gonna have that with most other chiller setups. The problem was I didn't have an insulated tub, so I found myself having to chill this thing frequently, especially in the summertime when it was here sitting in my garage. So what I ended up doing was I bought one of these little digital timers that you can plug in a couple outlets to, and I used that timer to cool down my water at the times when I was doing my ice baths, which helped with not having to insulate the tub. Also in the summertime, it got really hot in here, and even if the tub was insulated, because I've had other tubs that were insulated, I don't know if it would have stayed as cold anyways, so you would still probably have to run your chiller regardless, and having a bigger chiller meant that I can cool it down faster. So really these 3 parts are all you need to have your cold plunge setup. You need a pump, you need a chiller, and you need a container. You'll also need some tubing or hosing or PVC piping if you want to go that route. I decided to go with PVC hosing. I got all this 1-inch hosing that I connected to my chiller and my pump. The chiller itself came with different adapters that you can fit onto it. I ended up having one break on me, so I went with the glued in one like this, but there was also some screw in ones that came with the chiller that I got. Basically, the way it works is really, really simple plumbing. You just need some clamp rings and a couple adapters, and you can buy all of that stuff on Amazon or Home Depot. It's really not complicated. I ended up using some barbed male irrigation lines to male threaded lines to connect to the pump and the chiller, but it really is just an inline and an outline. One goes from the pump and it runs into the in, and then there's another line that comes from the out that would go back into the tank. That's really as complicated as it gets, and you always want to make sure that you have it connected to a GFI outlet just in case, so you don't electrocute yourself. I always unplugged everything before I got into this thing just as an extra precaution. The submersible pump made me a little nervous. I didn't want to leave that plugged in because there is electricity running through it, but the GFI should save you. But just in case, I don't want to be the guy that died in his garage in his DIY cold plunge. The submersible pump does have an option to run a line and keep it outside of the tank. It wasn't a self-priming pump unless it was submerged in water. So if I used it outside of the tank, which I tried a couple times, it would just be a pain. I'd have to prime it and try to suck and blow water through it each time that I turned it off. And I just didn't want to have to deal with, especially that I had it on a timer and I didn't have it running all the time. I would have to do that every time I turned it off. I just ended up using it as a submersible pump, and it worked great that way. I want to talk about some of the other things that I used for it and how I kept it clean. It was some of the recommendations from different people, like David Mouse Jr., I think is his name, and the DIY cold plunge guy. Really, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I got all of this information from other YouTubers. I'm just kind of talking about how I ended up doing my setup. This is some of the extra stuff that I had and some of the ways that I kept it clean. An ozone generator was something that was highly recommended, and I ended up picking up this ozone generator. It was about $100. You just connect this line right to the bottom of it, and then you just stick this little end with the stone aerator into the water and leave it there. I got this one because it had a timer feature and you can set it to go off for different amounts of time, and I found it to be a better ozone generator than some of the other ones that were recommended. It was just a personal choice why I went with this one. I honestly don't know what the hell an ozone generator does, but a lot of people recommended it. I guess people use them for their hot tubs as well, so I put it in there as an extra way to keep the water clean and nice. The next thing I have here is a GE Total Home filter setup. This was recommended by the DIY cold plunge guy. The filter that I used was the sediment filter here. It looks like this. They have different types of filters, and I guess it's the type G. This was the one that I used. It kept the water really clean. A lot of the times people would just use a little sediment filter like this. Really what this type of filter does is just keeps your pump safe. The submersible pump that I got did have a filter that would catch a lot of large objects from going into the pump, but if your pump doesn't have that, you want to have a sediment filter like this to prevent anything from going in there and breaking the pump. But this filter setup actually keeps your water clean. Another nice thing was that you could reuse this a lot. I would wash this out every time I'd change the water, which was about every 2 weeks, and I ended up only using one of the filters and just kept rinsing it off every time I changed the water, and it lasted me forever. This filter was actually pretty cheap. You can get it at Home Depot or you can get it on Amazon. This was about $40 and the replacements were about like $10. This thing here is a UV filter, and it's really good for keeping the water from turning green. It was about 30 or 40 bucks on Amazon. It's an aquarium filter that you just kind of put in there. I used the suction cups to put at the bottom of my tank. It just ran all the time. I left that plugged in with the ozone generator pretty much 24/7 and running all the time. The ozone generator was on a timer and it went off every few hours for a certain amount of time, and the UV light filter here was running pretty much 24/7. And while those things helped keep the water clean for the most part, I found that when I was taking a lot of plunges and I was doing them a couple times a day or at least every day, the water would kind of get cloudy and it would kind of get dirty. And a few people recommended using food grade hydrogen peroxide, which I have here, but I found that that really didn't work well. It was nice for like the first time that you change the water. It didn't keep the water clean long enough, and after a week I would start to see the water get cloudy and kind of nasty. So as someone who used to own a swimming pool and has dealt with pool chemicals before and didn't really care about having some chlorine in there if it meant keeping the water clean and having to change it less frequently, what I ended up doing was just buying some chemicals and a little chlorine floater for a hot tub and putting that in there to keep it nice and clean. And that's what I have here. So here's the floater that I got. It's a hot tub chlorine floater. It got the job done. All of this stuff I purchased on Amazon, and I'll have a link for the Amazon stuff down below for this setup. I got some little 1-inch chlorine tablets here, which this, I don't know how many were in here, but it was more than enough. There's 23 pieces here. It's 1 pound of chlorine. All of this was fairly affordable. We're talking about this whole kit that I'm showing you here was less than like $100. I got some tester strips so I can check the alkaline and the pH and the chlorine for the water. 1 tablet of chlorine was enough to keep the chlorine levels right where I wanted it. And my water here was pretty good. It wasn't too hard. So water right out of the tap actually had just the right amount of alkalinity and pH. So I didn't have to mess with it until about a week later when the chlorine kind of kicked in. And then I had to adjust the alkaline occasionally. So really this is all pH up, alkaline increaser, and then pH down. These 3 bags were like 25 bucks on Amazon. I think this thing was like 10 bucks, and I think the chlorine was like 10 bucks, and the strips were like 5 bucks. So that right there is pretty much how I kept everything clean. Besides that, the last thing that I had for this setup was a cover. You can see here I use this polar protector. I think it was like 35 or 40 bucks to fit this 150-gallon stock tank. It's the exact size for it. It's made for this specific tank. Again, I bought it on Amazon, and I just used that to keep bugs and any like dust and crap from getting in there so that the filter and the pump wouldn't have to work any harder and the water stayed a little bit cleaner. That's the main setup. I ended up getting a sponsor who sent me a smaller setup that was this one right here that I have hanging on my lawnmower drying out right here. And there's the pump. And the main reason why I stopped using my DIY setup was because I got that set up and it ended up being more convenient. The thing is, at the time of me setting up my DIY setup, I couldn't find something at the price range that this smaller setup was that the sponsor sent me. And had I found that, I probably would have ended up buying that instead because it was a lot cheaper. It was about half the price. But a few things to consider on that note is that the chiller that I have is way more powerful than the one that came with this smaller setup. But really, the only thing that helps with is cooling the water down faster. The bigger chiller that I have will get the water down to 36 degrees, which that smaller setup that I was given would not get that low. But as someone who was doing cold plunges every single day, I found that I only took it into the 30s a few times, and really like my sweet spot was 40 to 45 degrees, which the smaller setup was able to get it down to that temperature. So in hindsight, I probably would have saved the money by buying something like that, but at the time, I couldn't find anything that was at that price point. So the DIY setup was a little bit cheaper. It was also kind of like a little hobby project that I did, and it became part of my personality for a while. So doing the DIY setup was kind of fun. But if I could do it all over again and I could find something for half the price like this one that I was given, I probably would go with that because it was just a quick and easy thing to set up, and I didn't have to deal with all the piping and PVC and Teflon tape and gluing stuff together and having pipes break and dealing with just having to tend to my DIY setup, because I did put a few hours of my time just getting it set up. There was a lot of trips to Home Depot where I didn't have the right parts, or I had to order other pieces because I was missing stuff, and finding everything that I needed to get it working correctly, like that filter, and testing different things was kind of a pain. And if you're just someone who's trying to get into some cold water for a few minutes a day and you don't want to have to deal with all that, I would suggest that you shop around a little bit, because this DIY setup, when it was all said and done, cost me a bit of time, and it cost me almost $2,000 when I incorporate all the expenses and all the things that went into it. And that smaller setup, after the 50 bucks off that you get with it, is like $950, which I'll also link below just in case you want to check that out or shop around for other ones that are at that price point. Because even though the DIY setup seems like a cheaper option, you commit a lot of time to doing it. But if you want to take it on as a pet project. It might be fun. I enjoyed doing it and I don't really have any regrets about it. And that's just my 2 cents on that. With all that said, I hope this video was helpful. Again, I apologize for it being so rushed and kind of run and gun style how I just did it, because I just forgot to do this video and I got busy and now we're moving. And as I'm packing this stuff up and cleaning this area out, I'm like, oh crap, I need to make a video on that. And I know a lot of people wanted me to make this video, so I hope that by me making this video, it helps someone out there who's interested in setting up a cold plunge on their own or just shopping around and seeing if this is a good option for them. And I hope it was enough information for you to make that decision. All right, with all that said, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.